So how are we going to do it this time to check whether we're actually getting sound this time?
Great. I'm going to get a message. Go ahead.
Go. Hi everyone. Welcome to my regular monthly or so Facebook town hall. It's nice to see you all. Although I can't see you, I have to admit. I hope you're all doing well in this challenging time, and I know that there's a lot going on out there. Thanks for joining me tonight. A lot to go over. It's been a month since we spoke, but today is one of those days where we're sitting in Parliament. At the same time, we've got a whole bunch of activities that are in the riding here. But I can tell you that from 7:30 this morning until 4:30 this afternoon, I was on Zoom calls. And I'm going to be on Zoom calls again later tonight. So the days zoom right by, as we say. Not to make too much of a joke about it, but it is something that a lot of time gets taken up just on these screen meetings. And it's like being in meetings. Anytime you're in a job, you realize how much time you need in meetings and how much time you actually need outside meetings in order to get the actual work done, to make sure your meetings are productive at the end. But it's been an interesting month since the last time we spoke. Parliament's been busy, which is good because we wanted Parliament to come back, and now the committees are meeting again. We're up to twice a week with our Natural Resources Committee. You'll recall I was named the Shadow Minister for Natural Resources. As such, I'm the Vice Chair of the Natural Resources Committee. So it gives me a lot to do. There's 4 Conservatives on that committee and 5 Liberals, and then a Chair who's also a Liberal to break the tie, and a Bloc Québécois MP, and a New Democrat MP. So we try and get some things going where we actually can move forward. We're doing a study right now in forestry, which is a little bit easy to get through at this point in time, considering most of the problems we're facing in the world, and Canada in particular, revolve around our energy industry and its role in Canada going forward. And obviously I think there's a sharp difference between our push on where this industry needs to come out in Canada post-pandemic and where the current government's concept where this industry should be. So we move forward on that. I was able to speak in Parliament. I think some of you may have seen it on Bill C-229, which is a private member's bill sponsored by my colleague from Edmonton, James Cumming, Edmonton Centre, and it was on repealing the tanker ban. Now we all know that it's not going to pass, but getting out and speaking on it in Parliament is actually hopefully creating a lot of narrative for the rest of Canada to understand how this tanker ban happened in the first place, after we'd gone all the way through and getting so many recommendations for the pipeline that was going to go, and Enbridge has planned the pipeline all the way to Prince Rupert to get our oil to international markets. Because we don't have that pipeline, we are losing so much money on our commodity as a result of not receiving a world price for it. And that continues to this day. Last year, I think the number we came up with was around $16 billion was what we suffered in Canada not earning because we weren't receiving the world price for our resource. That has to change. And the better access we get to markets, especially international markets, the more that is going to change. And it was my pleasure to speak for 10 minutes on that in the House of Commons a couple weeks ago. I have also a private member's bill, and it's dealing with qualified environmental trusts. It's a task I had at one of my previous jobs, where we actually tried to get the oil and gas industry treated more fairly in the tax system in Canada, so it matches the way we treat taxes vis-a-vis other resource industries, where you actually have qualified environmental trusts. Right now we don't have those in oil and gas. I've received some pushback from the Liberal members in the House on that, trying to say that my motion is out of order, although it was already ruled in order once. But these are the shenanigans that get played in Parliament even for something that should be beneficial for the whole country and wouldn't detract from any agenda in any respect. But I'll tell you, the biggest challenge I have is on the horizon here with what's called the Clean Fuel Standard. As the Shadow Minister for Natural Resources, I've been meeting with industries across Canada on this, from the agriculture industry to the manufacturing industries to obviously resource industries across resources, so mining, oil and gas, forestry. They all see the problems with this regulation. It's not legislation, so you won't see it in the House of Commons, And the problem with regulation that's being advanced by one department only, and this is Environment Canada, climate change, that is actually moving this agenda forward, is that the people, the public officials in finance, the public officials in industry that are going to be the ones that actually recognize all the jobs that are going to be lost as we export these jobs to other jurisdictions, particularly the United States and Mexico, because we have a trade agreement with them, but also overseas because of this clean fuels standard. And there isn't that input happening at the bureaucratic level. There is a one-sided move here to actually get us towards these Paris agreements, and the way to do that is with this so-called clean fuel standard applied to industry. Of course, any tax on industry is eventually passed down to the consumer. As I say, the main effect for Canada will be job bleed to other jurisdictions and higher prices for Canadians at the pumps, in the heat, in heating their homes. Canadian Energy Resource Institute came up with a number that says it would cost $1,300 more per year per household. And this is based on a carbon cost of over $350 per ton that they're putting here. Now, I've looked at all the models going back for a long time, back in my previous career, and the highest number anybody ever came out with for costing carbon in what we call the externalities of production was $50 per ton. I've seen it between $20 and $50. And you think about our carbon tax right now, $30, going up to $40, going up to $50, none of which again goes to legislation. It's just part of the advancing regulations. These are manageable numbers compared to $350, which will be, in effect, a hidden carbon tax on everything we produce in Canada. It is something we need to make sure people are aware of, and that they raise the alarms at so many levels. I know that a lot of people have raised the alarms on it, but it's imperative that people understand what the government is doing by regulation alone here, not even getting any legislation requirement on it. And one of the great things about my job is, like my old job, I get to see new technologies. So we're out at the Shepherd Energy Center, which is just outside Edmonton. ENMAX runs that power production facility there. And they've got a CO2 stream that comes off there now. And attached to that, of course, is 5 startup technologies that are all about utilizing the carbon that we produce in burning natural gas, which of course has a much lower footprint than some of the heat fossil fuels we've used in the past. And we're getting further and further along at a lower and lower cost for how we actually deal with the carbon. This is very positive, of course, for us going forward, because I think that there's so many solutions that we have as far as adjusting to a new carbon reality in Canada that doesn't require us just throwing money at the wall to actually see what comes up here. You'll recall that the new throne speech was based on something called the Task Force for the Renewable Recovery. The problem with that is, of course, it's go big on solving greenhouse gas emissions. Go big means throwing money at the wall, and that's exactly what they're doing. I'll give you one example. In Ontario, and the provincial government participated in this too, so I'm a little disappointed, but you look at where the government spends their money now and has chosen to spend their money. $600 million is going into the restructuring of an auto plant, the refit of an auto plant to produce electric vehicles in Ontario. They're going to get 3,000 jobs from that. So we're spending $200,000 per job of taxpayer money. It's a lot of money per job to produce vehicles that we subsidize between $5,000 and $13,000 per vehicle in Canada. So you can imagine what the export market is, zero. And on top of that, we're going to have to subsidize, of course, the refueling mechanisms all across Canada for that very same type of change that we're looking at here. These are numbers that are going to stack and stack and stack. And yet, what are we trying to solve at the end of the day? An environmental solution. And this is a very costly, very centrally designed, picking winners type of way to approach the situation. There are so many better ways of approaching this. I'm appalled that we're actually moving in this direction. We need to hold the government to account. It's really difficult to watch them do this under the guise of a pandemic at this point in time, when we really should be focusing on making sure people are safe, the economy is continuing to function at a level that is allowed in this time, and it is unusual time. Let's acknowledge that. I need to make sure that people understand we're dealing with something that we haven't seen in a century. And hopefully we'll get through this very well at the end. I know we're all waiting and adjusting appropriately. From a political point of view, we lost an election that I thought we had a good chance of winning in York Centre, but we were close. We lost by 1,000 votes. So think about the gains we're making with the new stamp on our party out in areas like York Centre, which is very, very Toronto. So we are going to gain some seats going forward here, but we have to make sure that our message resonates across the country. And it is a new message. There's a reason people feel they weren't voting Conservative before. We need to make sure they understand how we represent them in this future that we have for Canada and move forward. It was my honor last week, of course, to be present at a handful of ceremonies to honor our fallen soldiers. And that included at the Military Museum, that included at the Kirby Centre, that included watching one of the sunset ceremonies at the Field of Crosses on Memorial Drive. And we even dropped in at the Legion. Unfortunately, they had to cancel their event because of COVID restrictions. But this is a very important day that we honor our Canadians who have given so much for us in the past. We owe them a lot. And, I was pleased to be there. A lot going on. I think there's a few physical events I've been to, but the one coming up on Saturday, I invite anybody in Ramsey and Inglewood to make sure they come out and see me. We're going to do it in a very socially distanced, acceptable way at Inglewood Community Hall on Saturday, around starting at 1 o'clock. So looking forward to that. One thing about being a new politician in this COVID era is I haven't been able to meet as many of the constituents as I wanted to in this job, and this gives me that opportunity on a smaller scale to get out and mingle, although in a very safe and socially distanced manner. Thanks very much. I think I've rambled on like I always do, but I wanted to give you a full description of what's going on in my life over the last month, and happy to entertain some questions right now. Okay, I see some popping up on the screen here. 1 second. Got a question here. Many people are asking about Justin Trudeau's comments about using the COVID pandemic to reimagine the economy. For instance, Robin writes, I'm wondering if the Conservatives are aware of the developments around the World Economic Forum with their proposition of the Great Reset. As you may know, they had a meeting in June and there is a big event planned for January 2021. The globalists are pressing their ideas upon the world. They want to reimagine capitalism until it utterly disappears. Yes, we are very aware of exactly what you're talking about. There is a large penchant in this government to move towards programs that are really internationalist in scope. In keeping a focus on that, what we want to make sure is that we're bringing some Canadian solutions to the United Nations, more so than bringing United Nations solutions to Canada. The thing about politicians is you'll find that most of them are careerists, so they get into being politicians at a young age. And the launching pad, of course, is to a glamorous international job. So this is a feeding frenzy where we get more and more people involved in the international level in politics as opposed to just the national level. The thing about the international level is nobody unelects them if they're going in the wrong direction. The thing about democracy here in Canada, of course, is that if the Canadians feel you're going in a direction that doesn't suit the country, they've got a voice to sort of say, enough of that, we're choosing somebody with a different direction. And that's where we need to respect democracy and make sure that people are getting value for money and people are actually having somebody accountable for the result at the end of the day. That's what I stand for. That's one of the reasons I ran for office, and I'm going to make sure that we continue to follow that. So we'll keep our eye on all these things, but obviously we've got a lot of other fish on the grill here that we got to pay attention to. So thanks for the question, and everybody pay attention. Another question here from Betty, who asks, why are disability supports in the form of a tax credit rather than a check? Betty, last I checked on this, the disability check is actually payable by check, and it's between $300 and $600, or it can be down as low as $100 if you took $500 as both a GIS and an OAS payment earlier. But the total number you'll get The maximum total number you get is $600, and it is a check. So I'd urge you to take a quick look at that. Call my office, please, and we'll make sure that you get the appropriate application to make sure that that check gets to you. Thanks, Betty. And a question just popped up here from Daryl Bishop. Daryl asks, will the CPC stand up against mandating COVID-19 vaccination? Daryl, nobody has ever suggested that there will be mandatory COVID-19 vaccination. So I'll stand up for that. Nobody in our party has come up with saying that anybody has to be vaccinated for anything, and it hasn't been on our agenda at all as far as something we've seen on the come here. So I would encourage you to kind of make sure if that's brought forward as a real concern from somebody saying that the government's talking about mandatory injections, that you get a hold of my office right away, because it isn't something that we've even heard about. Thank you. Now I got a new one here from Vaughn Lacharit. Vaughn asks, is there a committee that works to identify a few BHAGs? I think from my consulting past, that means big, hairy, audacious goals, or one that can be legislated, that all parties can agree on regardless of what party is in power, and that will help us to focus on the things we need to do. Oh, then he defines BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal. Thank you, Vaughn. The thing about politics is our role as the official opposition is to identify what we think the government isn't getting right. So there is a public service that transcends politics in Ottawa, supposedly. I find a lot of them to be somewhat partial, if you will, to one agenda or another, and I think it's human nature that people have a partiality one way or another about which direction they see government going, and then they align. And I don't think you lose that partiality just because you become a member of the public service. In any event, those hairy, audacious goals are actually something that are defined long ahead of time, but they're actually defined by political parties. Every one of these is dependent upon, of course, funding. And those funding changes between the priorities set by different parties that get elected or get unelected. For instance, you take a look at our defense strategy. Our defense strategy should be much more focused on the long-term build-out of what we need from defense mechanisms, both from people perspective and from, of course, the equipment that's required for our forces to be effective around the world. So yes, I agree there should be some big, hairy, audacious goals. Unfortunately, getting people aligned on that across the country and across parties is something that changes and shifts back and forth. And again, that is the nature of democracy. Thanks, Vaughn. I have a question here about the Canadian oil tanker ban. Peter asks, can you make sure that the repeal of the Canadian oil tanker ban comes with a major step up by industry of prevention on crisis response? Historically, they've done a pretty bad job, and that is why many people are so sensitive. They need to help themselves here. I think by they, Peter is talking about the oil and gas industry. Well, Peter, like I say, I spoke at length in the House of Commons a couple of weeks ago on a private member's bill about repealing the Northern BC Shore Canadian oil tanker ban. The reason we do that, and the reason that that was able to go through when the Northern Gateway pipeline was approved by what was then called the National Energy Board, was because there were several, like 269 recommendations put forward by the National Energy Band, some of which were an offshore response to any potential spill. I think you have to give our oil and gas industry credit, because there has been oil and gas movement on the west coast of Canada before, including in and out of Vancouver, primarily in, by the way. The issue at that point is, of course, that you've got never a spill, never an oil spill in the Canadian oil and gas sector. So I know that there has been spills, and people all attached to what happened at the Exxon Valdez back in the 1980s. It's a long time ago. Things have changed significantly since then, and our industry has become very responsible. And one of those, several of those recommendations was about getting a tanker spill mechanism for making sure that if anything did happen on the northwest coast, it would be addressed very quickly by a response. Thanks, Peter. Next question I have from Jerry. Jerry asks, instead of playing the Liberals game and just asking questions to the House that never get straight answers, I guess you're watching QP sometimes, can we not criminally charge the PM? I would think your ministers in the RCMP would have ample evidence to lay charges of corruption against Trudeau. Unfortunately, I don't think it's as black and white as that, Jerry. I think that you take a look at what we really saw in the WE scandal was people actually breaking the law, and and yet we're trying to get all that information, and it seems to be getting hidden from us by the mechanisms of government, including redacting full lists of emails back and forth, which aren't confidential emails. So you do have a mechanism here that is trying to stop that. If I think about breaking the law, I think about the Prime Minister's role in the SNC Lavalin scandal, which everybody seems to have forgotten about. But he was way outside what he should have done legally as a Prime Minister in that respect, and what we expect from a governing body, the separation between what an Attorney General does and what a Minister of Justice does. And he wanted to overrule that. So yes, I always wondered at that point in time why there wasn't some kind of a charge laid or an investigation, but there wasn't. It does seem to be a mechanism where a lot of the tools are not completely independent, and I don't mean to sound like it's something that's a foregone conclusion, but I am disappointed that there hasn't been more what I would call third-party investigation going on from the RCMP office, and I'm sure they have a good reason why they aren't. But I would like to see more of that, and I would like to see them reporting on why they aren't doing those investigations and why they're choosing to either to do so or not to do so. So thanks for that. I hope that was enough of an answer. But it is kind of one of those things where you look at where this government is leading Canada and you go, how is this sustainable? And I agree with you, and it is frustrating. Thank you. I have a question here from Wayne. It says, with all the money printing that is happening to pay for our debt, increasing numbers of people are trying to understand how the money supply and debt are related. I have a question for you about the government debt. I began reading a book on modern monetary theory, which says that as long as the federal government has the right to issue their own currency, be happy, don't worry. They do not come out and say it, but as far as I have read, the only way to pay down the debt is to print more money. And I am thinking of Germany of 100 years ago and how that worked for them. Is it possible to print money to pay down our debt to a very manageable number without flooding the market with Canadian dollars? Wayne, you and I can, we can wax on about this. So it's one of the issues that my party actually looks to me for leadership on, because I did work in finance before coming to this job. And it is something that isn't that well understood by the Canadian population, but even by politicians. There's a difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. And monetary policy, of course, is where the Bank of Canada, which technically is a Crown corporation owned by the Government of Canada, decides on the money supply. And when it decides on that money supply, lately, and only recently during this pandemic, it has stepped into the debt buying markets in Canada to a level that is astronomical compared to how much the balance sheet of the Bank of Canada was before. So the balance sheet of the Bank of Canada was about 120 billion before. Now it's up about $550 billion. So you think about what our deficit is, which is where the government has had to print money in order to pay the bills, and then it issues those bonds to the market. It's printed about $400 billion worth of bonds since the pandemic. The unfortunate part is the balance sheet of the Bank of Canada has gone up by more than $400 billion. So they've printed more money than the government has actually issued in bonds. That's a problem. So the buyer of choice now is the Bank of Canada. So you can talk about how this gets stacked, but at the end of the day, the only people responsible for the debts of the Bank of Canada, of course, are the people of Canada through the Government of Canada. So you talk about Enron or any of the Ponzi schemes that happened way back when, we've just entered into it in a government format. And all governments are doing it. So it's something that came out about in the large currency issuing countries back in the financial slowdown in 2008. Canada only entered it in this pandemic, and there's no way out of this. The U.S. has shown us that once you enter this market, nobody has a demonstrable way out of money printing. So we're waiting to see, but it is an experiment that nobody really realizes, what the outcome is. You're right, at the end of the day, if we owe ourselves all this money, is it just dilution of what we have? You're right. It is a dilution of the value that Canadians put into their work. Our currency will be worth less. Unfortunately, currency is relative. So a lot of world currency is going to be worth less. But in the end, somebody's going to have to pay this back. And that's going to be our kids, our grandkids, and a higher tax going forward. So we will continue to watch this and continue to try and address different ways of approaching this situation. Thank you for the complex question. Next question is, it looks like that's all the questions we have tonight. That's the last one, Mike? Okay, so a short number of questions tonight, so it's less than half an hour in here. Let me say a few things that I didn't say because I wanted to get all the questions. But I'll talk about where the government's strategy is at this point in time in Ottawa. If you're watching the bills that are happening in Ottawa, there's just a few things going on. The government's, of course, and we look at this all the time, we look at the response to the pandemic. And the pandemic response is, of course, where we have to give the government latitude to issue spending, moreover, they're called supply bills. The last one on that was C9, which was a couple weeks ago, and if you saw my questions to the Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, you can see where we're drilling into where she might not have clarity on the numbers that she's actually seeking. And in fact, they missed the process about how they actually have to do this, so it has to come back before Parliament in order for them to address things like the rent subsidy, which they missed on this one. And I asked her those questions directly. I know that some of you saw the requiem, if you will, I put for Bill Morneau when he resigned as finance minister, and I thought that he was a substandard finance minister in the Canadian history, and there's lots of touch points on that. Nevertheless, he was somebody that actually understands numbers on the other side of the house, on the Liberal side. And if you can listen to the current finance minister's responses to almost every question, it's very clear that she does not understand this role at this point in time. It's clear to me. I hope it's clear to everybody else. This is a problem for the country. We do need a finance minister that does understand the role of fiscal policy in Canada, the role that they have interacting with the Bank of Canada, which of course is the monetary authority, and make sure those work together and that they're the roles are meshing as opposed to one treading on the other's toes. And that seems to be not clear to the minister at this point in time. The division that this government wants to have as far as the social bills they're bringing forward, all of the bills they're bringing forward are social. There was the Judges Act, what we call C3, Rona Ambrose's bill. And I spoke on it in the House when we were back in session. It's something we want to support. We're fully behind. Went to second reading, and of course these go through 3 readings, but after second reading it goes to committee. So you heard me speak on it in the House of Commons at second reading. Then it went to committee. And as far as teaching judges and making sure judges had full understanding about sexual assault and the impacts that has on victims that are in front of a court of law is something that needs to advance, in our opinion, quite quickly, and is stalled twice in the Liberal governments, in various Liberal governments. We want to get that passed. So the Liberals took that to committee, and as opposed to moving it forward as quickly as possible, they threw in some ill-defined language that the judges should also be educated on systemic racism. And in as much as that's something that needs to be addressed in some ways, it is a deviation from where this bill had been at that point in time, and more or less opens it up to a whole new set of inputs as far as witnesses and definitions and everything going forward. So it will be stalled again, and that's the Liberals trying to find some division amongst the other parties in the House of Commons while they're looking to go to an election on a division. The Liberals do want an election before they actually have to show Canadians how they're going to pay for this pandemic and the money they've thrown at the wall. they do throw money at the wall here. They continue to throw money at the wall in the guise of we're solving a pandemic. If that is the main issue here, keeping the economy rolling and making sure that our health concerns are addressed until this pandemic is through, then this whole green reset that the Task Force for the Renewable Recovery clearly set the agenda for, and it's clearly reflected in the throne speech, needs to be addressed and abated quickly. We can address these things going forward once we see where industry is post-pandemic, where our environment is post-pandemic, and what we need to address going forward. This is something that everybody has to have on their radar screen. I'll keep pushing on this, as you know, and happy to take any of your input. If you want to call, if we need a meeting, I'm pleased. And I hope to see some of you at Inglewood Community Center this Saturday. Thanks for joining me again. And I think our next Facebook Live is December 16th, 6 to 7 p.m., so just before Christmas. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you again.